This presentation is entitled Black Male Educators and Nice White Ladies. My name is Ronald Cunningham, and while I appreciate the title, I am currently a PhD candidate and a law school student simultaneously. I'll get more into who I am once I get to my positionality. But I want to start this by emphasizing that at the center of this work that's going to be reflected here today is an exploration of the experiences of Black male educators. I'll preface throughout the course of this presentation, you're going to see and hear me probably use the term BMEs. You'll probably see it more than hear it. So I just want to preface so that everyone is prepared when you see BMEs, that's referencing Black male educators. That said, and I apologize for this. So I always like to start with positionality. I think that's important because that serves as the introduction of both myself, and it's also important to name in all of my work, I challenge the expectation and value that's associated with having no bias. We're all biased. I am biased and I acknowledge and I embrace that. So recognizing and naming our positionality ensures that we identify it, and we're constantly considering how that bias influences our work, as it should. So I identify as Black, I identify as male, and I'm an educator. I have the wonderful experience of being both a K-12 educator for about 23 or so years, but I'm also functioning in a higher ed space. So that makes my experience a little unique. I've worked directly and indirectly with at least 20 different educational organizations in 6 different states. So literally from one end of the country on the East Coast, Washington, D.C., to the West Coast in California, and several stops in between. I'm also an instructor in a university educator training program where the population is approximately 90% female and 85% white female. I interact regularly in my life and my professions with both white women in their capacity as colleagues and in K-12 and higher education settings. So I do want to sort of name again my positionality as it frames everything that I'm going to discuss today. So what is the purpose of this? This work represents, or is part rather, of a broader interest that defines all of my sort of scholarly activity. The data here is part of my graduate research, and it's taken essentially from 2 different studies. One of which is an autoethnography, which is qualitative research, and the other is a dissertation study, which utilizes a mixed methods approach. The autoethnographic work seeks to essentially problematize it seeks to problematize the effect of so-called social justice work of white female neoliberal K-12 educators who engage in harmful practices targeting Black male educators. And through my use of critical race theory, as well as critical discourse analysis, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, I try to make explicit how discourses authored by these women, who are the focus of this work, promotes white supremacist, capitalist, and misandrist values. So this work is informed by the 2 quotes on the right. So the first is a quote from Denton and Lincoln, the idea that external influences shape how children develop an understanding of themselves and their realities. And the second concern is when gender and race are misunderstood components in educational settings, all forms of learning and positive social interaction suffers. I wanted to open with those 2 quotes because that intersection of both the recognition of gender, but also the influence of what happens on how children develop their reality, again, frames what you're about to see here. So that said, I want to start by looking at some staffing trends in K-12 education. So this by no means represents a full representation of all major shifts in education, not at all. Instead, it considers some of the major trends that impact staffing in education, and specifically who makes up the population of working teachers. So to start at the upper left-hand corner, teaching in the United States was pretty much a a career originally designed for men and dominated by men. The gender shift occurred probably around the mid 19th century, when we have the emergence of the public school system. By the latter part of the 19th century, women were representing approximately 63% of the nation's teachers. So that by the early 20th century, we can see that elementary teachers in particular represent the majority. And so teaching has essentially evolved from a male-dominated profession to one that is dominated, particularly in elementary education, by women. So again, what I'm not doing here is endorsing a sentiment, nor am I suggesting that I'm in favor or question in any way. What I'm attempting to do here is recognize the social trends as they exist. So the next significant shift that occurs, if you look in the middle part of the screen, is the Brown decision, which we don't talk enough about. So while the Brown decision certainly represented the advancement of civil rights and directly contributed to the end of legal segregation, it also caused a forced expulsion of significant numbers of Black educators, Black K-12 teachers. So prior to the Brown decision, teaching was actually a significant means of Black people moving into the middle class. So as a result, there were roughly around 85 to 90,000 public school teachers who were all Black. After that 1954 ruling, however, more than half of them lost their jobs to white educators. That's significant. So as we continue to move down to the bottom column or the bottom row, we start to see in the 1980s, there's about a 31% increase in males as a result of the changing political and cultural shifts that are happening in the world. So, however, despite the fact that we see this cultural shift, it really becomes clear that while more men are entering the profession, and there's even evidence that the percentage of Black male educators entering increased at this time, that growth is simply not proportionally consistent with the student population. So yes, we do have an influx of Black male educators who are entering the profession, but that influx is not proportional to Black males who are students in public school settings. So what we end up with is a disturbing number of Black male educators leaving the profession, which is where we are currently. So what does all the data currently say about the educator workforce? So we can see that there are around 3 million public school teachers and around 50 million students in the United States. Between 87 and 2015, that teaching force nearly doubled. We went from 2.5 to 4.5 million public teachers. Although these schools were comprised of more than 50% students of color, far more than 50% of the educators were white. The view of teaching shifted. What was once a position of prestige then becomes a low status profession. And the number of Black teachers in 9 major cities dropped between 2002 and 2012. Washington, D.C. is a great example. The Black teacher workforce dropped from 77% to 49%. That's a massive decrease. So historically, what was the more prestigious religion or positions, doctors and lawyers, for example, they ended up attracting larger numbers of men. So what does the current data tell us about Black male educators? So we know that Latinx, Black, Asian, and Native American men account for roughly 20% of all educators. However, of that 20%, those are all men of color. Of that 20%, Black male teachers represent less than, it's actually somewhere between 1 and just under 2% of all educators in public school settings. Men or Black male educators specifically are oftentimes perceived as too male. Then they're oftentimes perceived as not male enough. So one of the traits that I found in my research, particularly when it came to men who identified as gay, is that they were having challenges with concerns when they connect their sexual identity, particularly if they identify as being out in their profession. They were oftentimes seen as problematic, and there were concerns. And there's a lot of literature that supports the idea that men who were not masculine or not male enough are oftentimes targeted. All races of students we know benefit from schools where a Black male educator is present. I gave a list of the sources for that piece of information just because I want to push the conversation from where it was about 20 or so years ago. Chance Lewis sort of championed that in the early 2000s. Essentially, we have been having the same conversation, which is, are there Black male educators in school? Yes, we already know that. Now it's time for us to shift that conversation. So there's an abundance of evidence in support of the fact that there are Black male educators in school. There's an abundance of evidence in support of the fact that Black male educators make schools better. All students benefit when Black males are present. Black males, however, are typically most present in the most challenging schools, and they are noticeably absent in those so-called high-performing schools. That matters. That makes a significant difference. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of shift a bit here, and I wanted to pose a bit of a what if you will. So I think these images sort of guide that consideration. So the images on the left represent a complete switch of what we are bombarded with in terms of children's growing perceptions. The images on the right represent historical accuracy. And I just wanted to just pose the question to this group. Consider the impact really of representation and how it challenges us to consider some of the what if. So consider once more how representation really has the capacity to directly inform a child's understanding of his or her surrounding. What kind of world would Black boys grow up in if they saw Black men as masters of content? What might that experience be like, and how might that make our public school experience, particularly for children of color, different from what it currently is? So that leads to my actual research questions. So I've listed some of them in the slide you see here. And on the left, you see the autoethnographic study. So in what ways do the discourses and actions offered by these nice white ladies, particularly these neoliberal educators, contribute to this declining presence of Black male educators in these classrooms? The questions that guide my dissertation study focus on how do the current practices inform the perceptions of Black maleness, and what policies can schools begin to employ to shift and better identify, train, and retain these Black male educators? So there is some intersection, and for the purpose of this presentation, I am pulling from both those studies, which are happening simultaneously. The autoethnographic study speaks a little more clearly to what we're discussing here today. I wanted to go back to a guiding principle, and I wanted to do that by referencing Paulo Freire. So essentially, what Freire is talking about in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed is the idea of the mindset of the oppressed. And so the question, it seems, or the issue, the concern, it seems, is the oppressed don't always so much seek an end to oppression, so much as they seek to just not be the one oppressed. But because all that individual has known is oppression, once that individual achieves some semblance of power, that individual innately uses that same power to oppress others. And in doing so, that individual ensures that he or she will not suffer, but also makes no progress towards actually eradicating that same oppression that was the issue to begin with. I think that sort of thinking is super relevant now as we talk about how two groups of oppressed people, we're referring to women, in this case, white women, and we're talking about Black men, so both of whom have been oppressed. How is it that we go from two oppressed groups to a situation where one seems to be causing the harm directed at another? And I think Paulo Freire's thinking helps guide our sort of direction that I want to take here. The other point that I want to emphasize is neoliberalism. So part of the whole neoliberal project is this manufacturing of discourses that work to normalize current social arrangements and help to construct them as the way things are. I want to challenge that thinking. So not only am I focusing on white female K-12 educators, but I'm looking specifically at those who identify as neoliberal. I want to narrow my focus very, very keenly so that there's no confusion as to who our target audience is here. And so here I just wanted to share a couple of images as we dive into the actual data itself. So the subject matter here challenges us to consider a couple of things, one of which is this intersection of a feminized profession where white women and their job security is prioritized and protected, alongside this sort of satirizing of Black male educators, where job security for Black male educators is neither a priority nor is it protected. You see a couple of images here, and I'll highlight just a couple. The one in the center is the lynching of a man, Reuben Stacy, who was lynched in 1935 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The reason I wanted to include this in part was notice the onlookers at this incident. Notice who is actually present and participating in what's happening at the time. The other image that I wanted to pull into the conversation was Emmett Till and the woman who sort of triggered what happened to Till, Carol Bryant. We know, and I think it was referenced in a 2017 New York Times article, Bryant acknowledged very recently that the most sort of incendiary parts of the story that she told about Till were false. We know that there is a history there. So what we're talking about is a centuries old pattern of white women positioning themselves as victims and authoring intentionally deceitful narratives for personal gain on one hand, while Black men suffered on the other. Sometimes the loss of life, sometimes the loss of job, but they always suffer in these situations at least. We know that schools criminalize Black maleness and society abuses them. And this is oftentimes achieved through language. Critical discourse analysis helps us to unpack that. We also know that stereotypes of Black men as being unintelligent helps rationalize this ability that Black men can run faster, that they're stronger, that they can jump higher than their sort of European counterparts. But it also reinforces that genetic distinction that speaks to the eugenics movement in the mid-1900s. So white America has long had a motivation to fuel the unintelligent Black man concept or stereotype. And this was done to prevent Black male from challenging that masculine power structure, if you will. So in feminized settings where women can't really physically dominate Black men, the reinforcement of this stereotype is oftentimes used to control Black men, and thus is the case in K-12 settings. So let's talk about how I frame this question. So I'm using both CRT and critical discourse analysis. So both are outgrowths of critical theory, which in and of itself is an approach to social philosophy and focuses on this reflexive sort of assessment and a critique of both society and culture. And it has this purpose of challenging the existing power structures. So with CRT, I'm emphasizing counter storytelling as evidenced through the autoethnography, but also interest convergence. So there needs to be a lot of consideration of how there were times historically when the interests of the educational system, white America, and Black male educators converged. Derek Bell tells us that interest convergence essentially is arguing that when Black Americans have experienced some sort of success, like with the Brown decision, those instances of success are typically a result of when white America has sort of, the interest of white America and Black America has converged. So there was some benefit to be gained from white America by doing away with legalized segregation at the time. According to Bell, were it not for that convergence of those interests, then Brown v. Board of Education may have gone a very different direction. And he has a very compelling theory. My push in terms of the interest convergence theory is, how do we apply it here? So when are those instances where the interests of Black male educators and education and white teachers, when they converge? But when are there also instances where they diverged, along with aspects of both when they occur in tandem, as I would argue is the case now? So we're talking about the experience of Black male educators. The reality is Black male educators are in buildings. We know that. However, critical race spatial analysis is part of my methodological approach. And what that does, so I've included an image in the upper right-hand corner. I'll challenge you to sort of think about an employment or staffing matrix. We know that Black male educators are in buildings, but what critical race spatial analysis allows us to do is to ask the question, where are they? What are they doing? I would challenge everyone in this space right now to think about how often do you and have you interacted with Black male educators who are masters of content, as opposed to those who function in supporting roles, who are behavior management specialists, as opposed to those who are athletic coaches, or function in some capacity outside of being masters of content. Critical race spatial analysis allows us to do that. And it helps the combination of critical race spatial analysis and CRT. It really offers an understanding of that occurrence. Critical race discourse analysis, going back to the previous slide, it also provides an apparatus that we can use to really explore the social and ideological conditions that make this privileging common sense. I like to throw out those terms of mission fit. In my interviews with a number of the Black male educators, that was oftentimes an issue, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. But the idea of someone being mission fit comes up a lot in their experiences. That normalization or that sort of common sense approach, quite problematic, and critical discourse analysis allows us to talk about it. Critical discourse analysis really sees these sort of linguistic practices as not simply a reflection that underlies social realities, but they really are constructing and legitimizing them. So again, in looking at these methodological perspectives, to look really quickly at autoethnography, autoethnography allows the ethnographer to become a participant observer. And it's very consistent with CRT's emphasis on counter storytelling. In this case, the goal is not so much, well, it challenges this idea of this third person narrative, passive voice. There's this belief that work written in the third person narrative is the ideal. The belief is that the passive voice, it erases our subjectivity and our personal accountability. And the message has essentially been that it was not important who gathered, who judged, and who evaluated the evidence, when in reality, this practice regularly has excluded minority voices. The reality is that by not insisting on some level of personal accountability, scholarly writing really reinforces this third person passive voice as a standard and affords significantly more value to these abstract and categorical knowledges than direct testimony. So autoethnography is really consistent with critical theory in its attempt to disrupt dominant norms around scholarly discourse. And critical race spatial analysis helps give us some language to identify sort of where this is and isn't happening. So quickly, let's look at who exactly are these nice white ladies. They have been present in scholarly works for quite some time. This just sort of highlights a couple of those instances, but there was not any shortage of their reference in texts. I want to emphasize that this is by no means not an indictment of all white K-12 female educators. It is not. It is, however, a recognition of my own experiences. It is very much a recognition of my own experiences. So some of the common traits that emerge are sort of posted here, and I want to give you an opportunity to look through them. As you do, I want to emphasize this term of nice white ladies is not synonymous with the term that we've heard of Karens. So for the purpose of this presentation, I want to emphasize that this discussion should not be seen as any variation on or any sort of connection with these so-called Karens. They are not the same individuals. And instead, this list reflects some of the traits that seem most present. So to some degree, these women are reflections of a system. So the question might seem, why focus on them as opposed to the system? My response is, what makes these women unique is that these women actively portray themselves as allies of people of color and claim to be social justice warriors, when in reality, a key trait is inconsistency with their articulated commitment to people of color and authentic social justice work on one side and their behavior on the other. Quickly, let's look at some of the common themes. So some of the common themes, I'll just look at the left side. Having to serve in disciplinary roles became a burden to Black male educators. Administrators conducting observations and writing one side of the whole story, they felt it was demoralizing. I couldn't look at these Black boys in the face and make them feel, and I couldn't look at these Black boys in the face and make them feel like I felt in school anymore. I was always interrupted during lunch, my teaching, grading papers, and preparing lessons to take care of someone else's misbehaving students. This speaks to the practice of positioning Black male educators as behavior management specialists. Quick example of the one piece of evidence that came from one of the narratives. And I'll just look at one of them. The top focuses on duties beyond instruction. One teacher spoke specifically, who is a Black male educator, about his principal pushing himself and a colleague who was a white male or white female educator, and his principal was a white female as well. The principal encouraged him to take ownership of basketball, to get involved in an extracurricular. The principal encouraged the female counterpart to take ownership of, it was either the student government or the National Honor Society. So the goal was for all teachers to be involved in an extracurricular activity. The challenge was the impact that that had on their capacity to function in their roles and to advance professionally. Student government or the National Honor Society met during the day, and as a result, that same teacher was allowed to enter and complete a master's program. As a result of her having completed that program, she advanced and became an instructional coach in that school. In that same setting, that Black male educator, who was encouraged, if not pushed, to take ownership of a sport, was already in a master's program. But because he was now coaching a sport that demanded they meet 4 to 5 times a week, he actually ended up taking an absence from and eventually not returning to his master's program. So what we have is an individual who was pushed down a particular track that demanded a burdensome amount of time and resulted in him walking away from a graduate program, and the complete opposite. Let's think about the impact that that has on their long-term professional standing in their community. So this obviously comes at a very early stage in the work. Some of the preliminary discussions and points that I want to emphasize in terms of points of change, we need to focus on the pre-service training programs. They need to be more intentional to ensure that these white teachers, these white female neoliberal students, unlearn unintentional and intentionally harmful practices. The other focus, in addition to the training programs, lies with the K-12 schools themselves. These schools cannot continue to serve as a haven for these problematic values, and instead the schools must begin to problematize individuals who both embrace and promote these values. I'm going to pause, or not pause, but stop there, because I tried to manage my time so I didn't run over. I appreciate your time, and I am turning this back over to our moderator. So thank you so much. I hope that was beneficial to everyone.
Thank you so much, Ronald. We are, hopefully y'all are taking notes and making some notes of some questions for after Olivia's presentation, and we'll open it up for some discussion. So at this time, we'll turn it over to Olivia Marcucci, and she is going to share her presentation, Creating Culturally Responsive Restorative Justice Practices.
Thank you all so much. Yeah, I think we're going to start the recording, and I'm happy to take questions. It is a little bit more truncated because, you know, I didn't know we had 20 minutes, so I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Olivia Marcucci, and I am here today to chat with you a little bit about a research project I had evaluating the implementation of restorative justice practices within a girls mentoring group at a predominantly Black high school. Now, as with everyone who's ever presented in a conference ever, I'm feeling a little bit rushed about trying to get a 2-year project down into 12 minutes. So some of the background methods and findings are a little bit high level overview. I have submitted a report to the district, high school, and nonprofit that were involved. So if you are interested in a little bit more in depth, particularly in the findings, because it was a practitioner oriented report, then please feel free to email me and I would be happy to share. So a little bit of background on the problem space, and I will be very brief about this. Most American schools, particularly predominantly Black ones, because of what sociologists have labeled racial threat, use exclusionary practices rooted in punitive justice to address student behavior. And these highly punitive and exclusionary schools have lifelong impacts on their students. However, an alternative to this punitive justice philosophy and exclusionary discipline has come to American schools in recent decades, and that's referred to as restorative justice. Now, restorative justice is an overall philosophy and a set of practices that focuses on harm repairing when a wrongdoing occurs. It's often credited towards different Indigenous communities across the globe. However, in 2014, Tori, who is a critical Indigenous scholar, critiqued this use of indigeneity in restorative justice scholarship as the commodification of Indigenous life worlds. So recent research in school settings particularly have shown that restorative justice philosophy and practices can have positive impacts on both school communities and individual students. However, at the same time, research and journalistic inquiry has found that that restorative justice practices are sometimes co-opted to reinforce an actual punitive justice philosophy, and or they're being implemented without proper educator training, which leads me to the context of the research study that I am here to talk to you about today. So there is a small, fully accredited high school that I have had a working research practice partnership along with one of my colleagues since 2014. The high school itself is about 90% Black, 2/3 free or reduced price lunch. It's in a suburban, what Milner would call urban emergent municipality of a larger metropolitan area. And at the start of this evaluation project, it was in about the second year of a district-wide restorative justice implementation. Now, specifically for this project, I was working with an in-house school nonprofit, and specifically, even more specific than that, I was working with the girls mentoring group that the nonprofit ran. Now, the CEO of this nonprofit, which I will refer to as Bishop, invited me because I had a history in the school and we knew each other well through my other research activities in the high school, to be a co-facilitator of Strong Women Will Succeed, the girls mentoring program, a pseudonym. And at the same time, he wanted me to start collecting some data. Now, this is a young and relatively small nonprofit, so he knew the value of accumulating data and evidence for the programs that the nonprofit supports. So he invited me to embed myself as a co-facilitator and a researcher in this Strong Women Will Succeed, this girls mentoring program. At the time, I took it over with my co-facilitator, who I will refer to as Miss K. The girls mentoring program was about 2 years old, and it was founded on restorative justice principles. The nonprofit itself was one of the pioneers of restorative justice in the district, even before the district started its district-wide implementation of restorative justice. So in collaboration with Bishop, we sat down and had a number of conversations about what types of data he would be interested in Strong Women Will Succeed and what would really be able to support him. Overall, he was interested in how restorative justice was being used in SWWS, Strong Women Will Succeed. After a number of collaborative meetings, we kind of narrowed that down to a few specific research questions. The first three really rooted in Bishop's interests, and the last one rooted in some of my biases as a researcher, which I will talk about in the next page. So the first research question, how are facilitators and students introduced to the philosophy of restorative justice? Second, how are facilitators and students introduced to the practices of restorative justice? Third, how are restorative justice philosophy and practices used to foster a positive, supportive, and emotionally engaging community within SWWS? And then finally, what are the interactional processes within a restorative circle that authentically represent restorative philosophy? And this one is the furthest from an evaluation framework and really was resting on my research interests at the time and current research interests. So it's kind of speaking of my biases, I want to be transparent about how this, what I initially called a process evaluation, although now I am questioning that label, how that evolved. So I am not trained as an evaluator. I very much situate myself as a learner in this context. So I was combining my very preliminary knowledge and growing interest in process evaluation with some of my other areas of scholarship and expertise. And now that I have engaged in this work more thoroughly and really engaged in the analysis part of this work, I realized that I really didn't actually do a process of evaluation. So the label is probably incorrect, particularly to some of the evaluator purists that I'm sure we have out there. And I kind of want to recognize that, and as we push back against kind of white supremacist culture, and particularly the standard of perfectionism that Gray talks about in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, I just want to say I appreciate your grace as I position myself as a leader, as a learner in the evaluation space and in the process evaluation space, that I'm slightly misusing that term of process evaluation. So given all that, what I do feel confident on is transformative research design and ethnographic data collection, two pieces of research design and data that I was formally trained on. So I use my background as a critical qualitative scholar, trained in transformative design and ethnographic fieldwork to answer some of Bishop's questions about restorative justice. Now, I want to take a brief ethical moment to say that I felt that the transformative research design was particularly relevant given my positionality as a white woman who was invited into this predominantly Black space. And I really wanted to make sure that I was mobilizing resources, be that knowledge, money, etc., into the hands of students and other folks from traditionally marginalized backgrounds. And I also communicated clearly with my students, my girls, as we sometimes call them, Miss K and I, that my position as a mentor always came before the research project that I was engaged in, which they all knew about and consented to be involved in. So if there was ever a moment where the student said, I don't want this to be part of the research project, absolutely no questions asked. That happened. I was mentor before I was researcher. So a little bit about the data that I used as input into the final report that I delivered to the district, high school, and nonprofit. I did over the span of 2 school years, 2017 to 2018 and 2018 to 2019. I did about 40 hours of participant observation, which was mostly the weekly group mentoring meetings that SWWS had. I had over about 12 to 13 hours of stakeholder interviews, and then I had a number of videoed components, including some student trainings, videoed restorative circles. I also held a number of student researcher focus groups, and those numbers are all in hours. So very briefly, I have less than 3 minutes left. I want to give the very, very high level findings that I had arising out of that data. So first is research questions 1 and 2, which, if you'll remember, are about how the facilitators and students were introduced to the philosophy and practices of restorative justice. So what we noticed is that within the first year, facilitators and students were not formally introduced to restorative justice in any way. And because I was embedded and invested in this transformative research design, where I was mobilizing resources to the students themselves particularly, I discussed with Bishop the idea of pursuing funding to plan and hold a restorative justice institute for some of the SWWS students, which I am very fortunate to receive. So we held this institute where I invited some of the SWWS students to a local university where they learned about restorative justice and philosophy, and learned how to lead specific types of restorative circles. And this RJI experience, and they were also paid for that experience. And this RJI experience showed that when introduced and prepared appropriately, the SWWS students were both willing and able to lead their own RJ circles, including choosing culturally relevant topics and facilitating them in culturally relevant ways. The third research question was about how restorative justice was used to foster positive community. There were two primary ways that Ms. K and I interact with students: group mentoring and one-on-one mentoring. In both of these ways, we relied on an overall restorative mindset, if not strict adherence to restorative protocols. Restorative practices are often governed by very specific protocols, which, while we did use some, because particularly Ms. K and I were not formally trained in restorative justice, we didn't necessarily adhere strictly to the protocol, although I do believe that we embodied a lot of the restorative philosophy. And I have a few specific examples from group and one-on-one mentoring, but because of time, I'm going to leave that for Q&A. And then finally, the research question 4, which again is mostly the least aligned, with the evaluation framework period, much less the process evaluation framework, is that I did find that during formal circles, when we were using specific restorative protocols, circle keepers could adapt some typical restorative practice protocols without losing philosophical fidelity. I'm also happy to answer more specific questions and examples about that finding. I concluded the evaluation report with a list of recommendations, which I can discuss later. And with that, I will say thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Olivia and Ronald, for both of your presentations. I'd like to open up the floor now for questions for both of our presenters. If you don't mind, this is just a small group of us. If you unmute yourself or ask a question, if you could just tell us a little bit about who you are and what brought you to the session. Y'all have to forgive me. This is my student affairs background coming in. We just got a little small group, so. There you go.
Hey, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Perfect. I had auditory issues earlier and I had to dial in from my phone, so I just wanted to make sure we weren't having any issues. I actually have a lot of questions for both of you all. I'll come back to you, Ronald, if you don't mind. Olivia, I just wanted to start off with you. I know, like, part of my experience in working with restorative justice in a K-12 space, some of the challenges with following the protocol of restorative justice and properly implementing that. I know you kind of said in some instances that you all didn't adhere completely to it. Could you talk to us more about, how you managed that, and then how did that influence any of your findings?
Yeah, definitely. That was one of the major findings, I would say, from my time engaged with, I'm still engaged with them, but in the formal research project. So very often, because the way Miss K and I ran the group mentoring space, it wasn't like hyper controlled in any way. We wanted the space to feel like theirs. So very often the girls would choose to, we always started the group mentoring with this check-in circle. So for those of you not familiar with restorative practices, it's one of the practices where you sit in a circle and it helps build up community rather than respond to a wrongdoing or anything. So very often girls would choose to sit outside of the circle and participate. Even more often, which is one of the findings I highlighted in the report, there would be side conversations. So it wouldn't be like again, for those of you not familiar, the talking piece is like a sacred piece in a restorative circle where the person who has the talking piece has the permission to speak. Anyone who doesn't has the permission to listen. Oftentimes that talking piece was not necessarily, held as sacred as perhaps very formal restorative justice practitioners would like to see it. But what I found is that when those side conversations were on topic and when they promoted communal laughter, like when they, and not at the expense of anyone, but when they promoted some sort of rapport building within this between the students themselves, that it was actually just as beneficial to socially and emotionally to the students as trying to hyper control them to fit this very particular protocol. So what Ms. K and I kind of organically did, it wasn't even like something we formally chatted, is kind of allowed those side conversations to happen, or allowed the girls to choose to sit outside of the circle and participate or not participate, to kind of give them that agency within the space about when and how they participated in it. So those are probably the most particular examples of when like formal restorative rules might have been violated, but I personally did not find that the underlying philosophy of restorative justice was violated. Might not work in all settings, but it worked for this one.
I do have a follow-up to that. So like I found it interesting. And that was one of the things for me as I kind of think and see restorative justice and restorative circles being implemented in various places, is I always wondered about like the cultural dynamic and just like the cultural responsiveness of it. It looks as if that, you know, you kind of embrace what was kind of inherent to those young ladies' dynamic in the way they interacted with one another. And so like, for me, one of the questions I have is, I know you said that it kind of comes from a lot of other places and stuff like that around the world, but was there any type of cultural consideration that was associated with, you know, incorporating this into these communities, and to what degree?
That's a great question. I will say, and this is again something I didn't fit into the 12-minute conversation. I did actually say this. I identify as a white person. Everyone else in the space identified as Black or Black and biracial. So restorative justice was not on my agenda. This was something the CEO of the nonprofit, who himself was a Black male educator, had designed into the program. And Ms. K also was a Black woman who helped facilitate it. What I will say about kind of cultural relevance and restorative justice practices, which I should have made more explicit in the presentation, is that when I found, when we were able to pay our students to be trained in restorative justice practices, and they had the agency to choose the topics and to adapt the restorative protocols in certain ways, I found those to be some of the practices that felt the most culturally relevant, just by nature. Like when you empower the students to design their own experiences in an educational setting, then like naturally they will be more culturally relevant, even, you know, than like a race matched educator could be. Like if you're literally, your peers are leading you, folks, I mean, this is a tiny district, so these students have known each other since they were 5 years old, most of them, that naturally can be. So I think encouraging and permitting student leadership within restorative justice practices is going to be the easiest way to facilitate culturally relevant restorative practices.
You got a follow-up?
I could talk all day to everybody. I didn't want to just fill the I want to give other people opportunity as well.
Okay. We'll open up the floor to see if any of our other colleagues would like to contribute or ask a question.
All right, y'all. I was gonna say, if not, Ronald, I got a couple questions for you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Ron McCowan. I'm a senior researcher with a company called Decision Information Resources. We're headquartered in Houston, Texas. We're a Black-owned company, full-scale research and evaluation firm. It's been in operation for 35 plus years. I'm a former teacher, high school teacher, and athletic coach. Got my PhD. Had to quit coaching to get the PhD on the side. Been working as a researcher since 2007. So I left the classroom. So my question my initial question for Ronald is, so do you think that there could be any impact on hiring decisions initially if Black males are not pushed into coaching as opposed to other clubs? Do you think that could have a negative impact on, who ends up getting selected?
So that's a great question. My concern, because I want to look at it more critically, but my response based on what I do understand is yes. There are schools now that follow this model, and this model didn't exist, at least not formally, prior to maybe 20 years ago. But there's this model now, and it's part of this, any school that considers itself part of this sort of education revolution, and I'm thinking about these Teach for America based schools, these young, a lot of charter schools, but it started to filter into public schools now, that they have this model. And the model is essentially where you typically have a principal and you have two sort of lenses. One is the academic lens, so that's the dean of academics maybe, and the other lens is the dean of behavior. About 3 or 4 years ago, it seems like they've gotten rid of that. And now you still have the principal, and the academic dean is now the vice principal. And the dean of behavior is still a dean, because there was a need to sort of prioritize and rank them. So that model has shifted in terms of the language, but it still exists. The other thing that I noticed is that overwhelmingly, Black males dominate that space where they are the discipline dean. They are grossly underrepresented, if not completely absent, from the spaces where they are the academic sort of vice principal, if you will. And I'm leading up to why I'm saying no. I've sat in on conversations where that struggling school was having behavioral issues and needed to identify and locate and find a behavior dean. And the first thing that came out of those discussions, we need a Black guy, we need a Black. There was no discussion or consideration of skill set, qualification. The sole requirement based on those sort of preliminary actions, we need a Black man. So the assumption was that by having a Black man, that would resolve all of our behavior management problems. That came up not only in my own reflections, but it also came up in a number of those conversations in my interviews with Black male educators in such a way that I worry if we force schools to take a different approach, that was the way in for these Black male educators. People saying, I need a Black man, I need a Black man. And then you stick him in this role where it's a very sort of restrictive space. So it gave you access in, but there was no room to maneuver within. Based on that, I worry. But the question is, which scenario is of more benefit in the long term? I'm not sure. I think higher ed folks have the luxury of sitting in ivory towers and focusing on systemic racism and what have you. And those of us who also live in K-12, and I say that because I like to live in both, K-12 folks have a different lens, which is, I need a job. So my fear is some of those Black men who gained access into positions did so because of their Blackness and their maleness. And had that not been an option, they wouldn't have gained access. And a number of them would not be qualified to do what they do in any other space. So that is sort of my most thoughtful attempt at justifying why my answer to your question is I think, yes, it would restrict a lot of those men from those opportunities. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it definitely makes sense. I don't know the solution.
Right. But that's typically the case when the solution isn't change the light bulb, wear a different color shirt. The solution here is a mindset shift. So this is going to be a process because we're talking about changing the way that people think. And then at the same time, there's going to be a backlash, in which case we may see a dip in the presence of Black male educators until we have fully changed folks' minds. And so the question again becomes, is that sacrifice worth it? Because we're now talking about employment opportunities.
If I'm allowed, I have a question for Ronald. If
Absolutely.
I know, George, you might have one. This is like a little half-baked, so forgive me. But I was thinking through how you were using critical race theory, and it stuck out to me, the whiteness as property tenet, and and I'm curious if you've already thought this through, you just didn't have time in your presentation, but how that seems very relevant to thinking about the nice white ladies in K through 12 educational spaces. Like I have a specific ethnographic anecdote in mind for my own experiences, which I think is why I brought it up. But in this moment, in this anecdote, a nice white lady educator who was on the verge of having her contract terminated because of underperformance, was, in a way, if I can use the language, weaponizing both her whiteness and her womanhood in order to protect her material investment in this job. And I was also thinking your example with the educator who was guided to advising football versus an honor society, where there was a material disadvantage to that Black male educator because this white female educator had the white womanhood material advantage. So that was one of the horrible conference things where I'm not actually asking a question, but I'm curious if you've thought about whiteness as property tenet and applied it to your ethnographic context.
Absolutely. So just for context and in terms of my own positionality, discovering critical race theory was life-altering for me. I'm never going to not use it because I always see everything through the lens of a Black man, and that will always be the case. And I won't call it love or appreciation because those seem superficial. My acknowledgement of my innate CRT lens occurred prior to this ridiculousness that's happening right now. So I'm not even going to acknowledge that. But I say all that to say that you're right. When I referenced CRT in that slide, and I highlighted a couple of those key tenets, you're right, I did not highlight whiteness as property. It is absolutely a part of this conversation. And again, as you acknowledge, we're on time restrictions. And I think you did a better job than I did of managing yours. But the reason that I chose to not emphasize it in this context is because I want to remain internally consistent in terms of who is at the center of this work. And my concern is, given this context, if I had focused on the whiteness, as it is a part of the discussion, absolutely. And more so than some of the others that I didn't focus on as much, but I would not say that it is as integral as the interest convergence and the counter narrative. And I say that because by identifying whiteness as property, it positions the white female teachers at the center of this study. Their actions are the focus of this study, but I want to make very clear that at the center of this work is the experience of Black male educators. So whiteness as property is a variable, and it helps explain some of the actions, but I can't make it sort of a focal point of the analysis, just because in doing so, I would be positioning these white women at the center of this study. And that's exactly the opposite of what I want to do. I want to focus on their actions and their behavior, but at the center of this study is always going to be those Black male educators. I hope that makes sense.
Perfect sense. Thank you very much for that insight.
Hey, Ronald, how's it going? So let me go ahead and kind of situate my positionality for you. We definitely have some intersections. I used to work at DC public schools as well. I work in DC. I worked at a charter school in DC also. So just a quick little background on me. I did my doctoral degree at Florida State in education policy and evaluation. So my research, a lot of my stuff centers around using critical race theory and policy analysis. I currently work as an assessment developer for large scale state assessments, working on a bunch of Southern contracts and stuff like that, Southern states, students with disabilities assessments and things of that nature. In addition to that, working as a professional development consultant, I've had the opportunity to work with probably in the US over 70 school districts across the nation, like from East Coast to West Coast, so on and so forth, with hundreds of schools and educators and things of that nature. So when it comes to like this was very poignant to me because it was very relatable to me.
Oh, darn it.
What you talked about as far as
George, could you rewind? We lost.
I'm sorry.
A second.
Okay, so I was just saying, can you hear me now? Are we having any problems? Okay.
Yes.
I was saying it was funny how relatable some of the things that you stated, and I kind of felt it was unfortunate and it was a little bit frustrating, like me going into the field of education. My undergrad is in exercise science, but I started off as a PE coach. And then I kind of got put into special ed, teaching math, and got stuck there and couldn't get out, and dealt with a lot of things with supervisors, principals, and keeping me trapped in there. And because I wasn't formally educated as a teacher, and so I didn't understand that the value that I was bringing and the success that I was having would increase in math scores with students with disabilities. And so no principal in their right mind was going to let me come out of that space. So I left Florida trying to run away from that space and got put right back into that space in Virginia. And it took a wonderful principal to kind of explain it to me. And once she did, I accepted it and then pursued a master's degree in ed leadership as a K-8 math specialist, right? So when we start talking about the content piece, which was something that was interesting to me, the whole while I taught and I coached wrestling and football, but I was put in a position where I had to make a decision to stop coaching in order to pursue that master's degree. And, like what was the path I wanted to take in my professional career. So I found all of that interesting that you kind of highlighted those components in your study. And to that, I guess one of the things I did want to ask was like your sample population. Where are you pulling that from, or where is it like concentrated? Or I know if you can't say where, just like generally, what's the dynamics and demographics of the schools? And then two, there was one instance that I had in Kansas, just south of Kansas City in a school district, where there was actually a Black male principal and an all Black administrative staff, but a all white staff and an all Black student population. And it was one of the wildest things. It was kind of an anomaly. I had never seen it before. And I would just be interested to see if in any of your populations, do you have any examples, or are you seeking to see if there are any places where it is kind of flipped upside down? And then like, what would you find from that in the event that you would come across it?
So I appreciate your reflection. You just took me back to DC, proud graduate of Anacostia High School,
Okay.
Georgetown University. Like, I appreciate that. I'd like to, if you don't mind, answer your questions in reverse. In terms of that new model, and am I seeing it? I don't think I've seen it to the extent that, I don't think I've seen it to the extent that you have, but I've definitely seen it, where you've got overwhelmingly, if not complete, Black student populations, overwhelmingly, if not complete, white teacher population in that school, and overwhelmingly, if not complete, Black administrative team. I'm seeing that in some instances. I've not seen it where it's complete, meaning 100% all Black, but I've seen it where largely, mostly. So that is a new phenomenon. I just want to sort of think through what that represents. I have some thoughts about it. And most of them lead me to a conclusion that there's something problematic about that. But so that speaks to, have I seen that? In terms of the sample size and the population, so the information I shared today is pulled from two studies that are kind of happening simultaneously. So the autoethnography is obviously my own sort of exploration. And I give that value because I do consider us, but in this instance, me, to be a unicorn, because I am living in higher ed and K-12, and there's not a lot of that. I'm living in a legal space and a doctoral space, and there's not a lot of that. I am a full-time district chief of academics in a district. And I also am teaching classes in a university. So I've also taught in DC and Atlanta and Oakland and Cleveland and Indianapolis and New Orleans. So that sort of justifies why those experiences are interesting, because it can't be coincidence seeing this interesting little occurrence in Southwest DC and seeing the exact same thing in Cleveland, Ohio, and seeing the exact same things in New Orleans. Like, so that's where the autoethnography becomes relevant. To your question about the sample size, however, so the dissertation work is a sort of a three-tiered study. The first study involves me just looking at who is working in that building. So that starts with me gathering sort of HR information from any schools that will grant me access. And I've been given access to about maybe 6 districts, which is really good. That consists of 2 sort of larger public districts and a few smaller ones, so like a private or a charter. But it represents a district. So at the very least, it would be 2 schools. So that's a pretty sizable pool right there. So what tier 1 entails is just how many Black men are in the building. That's it. That's it. Then based on that, it gives me information to look at where they are in the building. So based on Black men in the building, I find out whether they're in the building. Then I send out a poll to all of those men, and they choose to respond. So that large number gets winnowed down to a smaller number. Based on those Black men who I reached out to, those who choose to respond answer a series of questions, because one of the challenges oftentimes is there aren't any qualified Black male educators, and we know that's not the case. So I want data to challenge that. So the survey is essentially asking questions about qualification. How long have you been teaching? What's your undergraduate degree? Are you fully licensed? Is your license in your area that you're currently teaching? So that gives me quantitative data on experience, which is tier 2. Then based on that tier 2 information, I pull folks who seem particularly attractive candidates, like how could you not want this person? And tier 3 is where I conduct a series of interviews. So that's where I get a lot of my qualitative data and information from them. And it's a pretty good population. Again, it's about 6 districts, and each district represents at least 2 different schools. The sample size for the next stage in terms of those surveys, I've pushed out hundreds and hundreds, but everybody doesn't respond. So as of this point, I've gotten back at least 50 of them, which is a good number. And then in terms of the interviews, I've conducted as of this point, a good solid, I think it's been like 7 or 8 of them. I don't need a significant amount, but I just want to make sure that I have enough to look back at some point and decide which is producing the data that is the most useful and usable. So does that all make sense and respond to your question now?
Absolutely.
Great. And thank you for that question too.
So I don't want to dominate, but I do have one more kind of thought to throw out. And I don't know if I said it, but I am a Black male. And that's how I've always considered myself. So I don't always look like it though. So just want to make sure I said that. My first 2 years of teaching, well, let me back up. Houston is the 4th largest city in the nation. It's a very diverse city. That being said, you have some schools that are very diverse and some schools that are extremely segregated. And so my first 2 years, I was at Booker T. Washington High School. It was not a very diverse school, entirely Black and Latinx student population, except for the magnet program, which was really a separate school. And so the staff in the main high school were entirely Black or Latinx, the student population entirely Black and Latinx. And the experience was still the same, even coming from Black female teachers. As a young Black male and as a coach, can you come deal with this discipline problem? And so just kind of think about that as food for thought as you're going forward with the project.
I appreciate that. And I spent a lot of time sort of reflecting on what role I wanted how I wanted to position Black females in this study. So my focus on the white female neoliberal educators is specific to the autoethnography. They are not the focus in my dissertation work. But your question was actually something that I pondered for, or your point was actually something that I pondered for some time. And the reality is I needed to make a distinction, because while there were certain women, regardless of race, because I could say that may have happened with a Latinx woman, like there were certain women who were not white women who engaged in some problematic behavior. My own experience was such that the women who presented themselves as allies, the women who were disingenuous and said one thing only to do something else, meaning position themselves as victims in ways that were harmful to me, and the women who engaged in this behavior specifically for the purpose of protecting or advancing their professional status. I'm not saying that that was the case across the board, but the women who did that in my 23 years of experiences, they were white women. My issues and interactions that weren't positive with other women, particularly women of color, fit into another space, but they didn't fit into that space where these women positioned themselves as victims, where they presented themselves as allies, where their work was done specifically, meaning their actions towards me were done specifically to advance their career. So if there's something about English teachers, humanities teachers, that's really dysfunctional. We all seem to think that we're the only one. So if I recall going into a space where there were a handful of English teachers, and of course I was the only Black person and only Black male there, and I was seen as a threat. Was I too ambitious? Was I wanting this role? Did I want to be the department chair? And so you didn't have to say that you were an ally, but you did. And so the actions and what you did in terms of sabotaging or attempting to sabotage me were done to ensure that you got a position that you thought I wanted. So I totally agree and hear what you're saying, Ron. I guess I'm just honoring my experience, because the women of color who engaged in problematic interactions, they were problematic, yes, but it wasn't problematic specifically in a way that was inconsistent with them representing themselves as social justice activists. And it wasn't done in an attempt to intentionally harm my career, but advance yours. But I totally am hearing what you're saying there.
We have about 7 minutes before the end of our session. And so I want to make sure that all hearts and minds are clear before we close out and open up the, Lord, I feel like I'm in church, open up the floor for any other questions for our two presenters.
Ronald, I wanted to come back and follow up on just the last conversation that you all was having. It touches home for me because to the point of what you were saying as far as what your experiences were and who weaponized their actions issue for their personal / professional benefit. Like I've had those experiences, like to the point to where, you know, like I had to file grievances and stuff like that. And you know what I'm saying? That worked out in my benefit. And, you know, like there were no disciplinary actions for the principal and the actions that they took. So I'm interested to see, like in your experiences, are you collecting those stories from the individuals that you're interviewing? And how are you component in your counter narratives piece, or are you looking at using that as that tenet of critical race theory to incorporate those narratives to, you know, speak to what these experiences are of these individuals and how it impacts their career? Like I know you provided the example of one person and his having to step back from his master's program, but even more so, like for me, you know, it was a determinant factor of me leaving the K-12 teaching profession, being in the classroom as an instructor. And it was a catalyst for me wanting to move in policy changes because I knew it was structural issues within the K-12 system that was negatively impacting our kids, as well as the ability of Black men to be in roles outside of what you're identifying right now. So I'm just interested in how you're collecting, or if you're collecting the stories, and what do you plan on doing, how you want to communicate that so that we can understand, you know, what people are going to through as a.
So another great question. And the short of it is, yes, I'm absolutely collecting those questions. The only concern that I have with CRT, and maybe that's another article that needs to be written, and maybe I better write it before I say too much, but my biggest beef, my concern with CRT is people, I think we need to get rid of the T in CRT. It's CRT at its core is actionable. CRT comes from the basis of civil rights activism. It comes from critical legal studies, like it's activists. So I hate the T in CRT because theory leaves it at something that's just said, and we all walk away feeling really smart and happy, and we wrote something and moved on with our little lives. But that's not what CRT is. CRT should be CRA, like it should be actionable, like it needs to be something that, and now what? So there has to be some change in policy, some change in action. You have to take that research and do something with it that makes the life of the participants in that study richer. If all that I do is take from them and use it in a way that sort of furthers myself, that is I think that's sort of qualitatively irresponsible, because the work should enhance those and the place from where the work came. So yes, my commitment is to get the experiences of these Black male educators, and then my obligation, my commitment is to do something to enhance opportunities for Black male educators. So that's represented through my dissertation work. But in terms of what my plan is for that, that needs to be addressed on a systemic level. So what I oftentimes do is speak to schools and those districts and talking about their hiring practices, because some of this, I really do believe, is situated in HR. This is an HR issue, quite frankly. So having conversations with districts about their hiring, retention, those practices that live there in a way that is motivated by this data, these experiences, that is arguably the most important part of this entire process. So great question. My answer is absolutely yes. If I didn't do that, then this work would have no value whatsoever. None. So thank you for that question.
Olivia, I got one more question for you. I actually just left Baltimore, and moved to Texas. I need to go back and close out a house there. With that being the case, I'm just thinking about people in Baltimore, kids in Baltimore, those students, and thinking about, the restorative practices. One, do you have any concerns that it has an adverse effect as far as their ability to assimilate in society and navigating and managing like our laws in the world outside of the school space? And do you think, I would think that there's a skill set as far as managing confrontation or issues that can be taken from that can be incorporated into their lives. And so kind of going back on, do you think they are taking that from those restorative circles and being able to apply that independent of what you all are facilitating for them?
First comment is, I didn't actually say this. I don't live in Baltimore. I work remotely and I live in St. Louis. I've lived here now for a decade. So I can't actually speak very much to the Baltimore context apart from a couple visits before the pandemic. But in terms of, and if I'm understanding your question correctly, do I feel like students are feeling empowered with a certain skill set so they can navigate can you explain one more time? So they can navigate civic life?
Yeah, their own social circles, like outside of that environment, outside of that school setting, when they go to their homes and their communities, are you seeing that they have a skill set that they can leverage in order to handle confrontation or issues in a different way?
I certainly do. And obviously, because of the nature of this project, I'm working with a self-selected group of students. So if we're having a conversation about a district-wide or school-wide implementation of restorative justice, and if the same exact skill sets would arise from that, where students are not given the option to participate, they just have to participate, it's very different than my girls who opted into this program. I mean, if we're comparing the practical skills of what goes into, planning, because my students were the leaders of the circles. So, planning and participating in restorative practices versus getting a disciplinary referral, maybe having a meeting with an administrator and getting suspended. There's a lot more pro-social skill sets that are being developed and kind of self-advocacy skill sets that in theory should be developed within philosophically authentic restorative practices. We can have a whole conversation about like when restorative practices are actually just being used to penalize students that are not actually embodying like a restorative philosophy. That's like a whole other conversation. But I personally do. And I don't think restorative justice is like a magic bullet or anything like that I know some folks, advocates, really feel like it can be. But I do think, going back to what Ronald was saying at one point, it is a mindset shift, and it's a mindset shift that has implications for entire systems and entire generations of students. So I do, but I'm a little biased towards restorative justice. Thank you for that question.
Well, thank you all so much for being very active and engaged in our session today. And join me in thanking our presenters, Ronald Cunningham and Olivia Marcucci. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. Clearly, it is definitely something that our participants or our attendees had lots of questions about. So I hope you took that or take that as some interest in your work, and continue to put your work out there so that we can continue to engage with it. So thank you all so much. I would encourage you, you will be getting an email shortly asking you to complete your evaluation for today's sessions. So make sure that you do that. Give us some really good feedback of this evaluation conference. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow at our full day of sessions again. So hopefully you all have a good evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.